Okay, we have today's final session. It's been a long and a very fruitful and rich day. Our final lecturer tonight is Professor Guy Stroumsa, who I'm sure everybody in this room knows well, and I don't feel that I have the need to introduce you. I guess I'll use the opportunity to say, Guy of course, is a member of the Academia, and Professor Emeritus of the Hebrew University, also of Oxford. Among the many wonderful books and essays that he has written, I want to mention a book which in my eyes is a scholarly masterpiece, the book that is called La Fin du Sacrifice, which offers a panoramic view of late antiquity and the changes that took place there throughout the Mediterranean world. He isn't feeling at his best, I believe, and so he's going to lecture while sitting. And he's speaking today about varieties of dualism in late antiquity.
Thank you, David. I apologize, I'll go the French way, lecturing seated, because simply an hour and a half ago I started feeling unwell, and I hope I'll be able to finish. Before, like everybody else, I say a few words about Shaul Shaked. I want to thank all of you who participated. I was asked by the chairperson of the Academy's Humanities section to organize this memorial workshop or conference, and I couldn't refuse. Of course, I didn't want to refuse. I said immediately yes. Shaked. At home, we used to call him Shakul Shaked because he was, as was known to the conoscendi, he was the judge, the hashofet, in his weekly coffee table meetings at Bet Belgia for many years. And he seemed to me and to my wife always to be the voice of reason more than anyone else. I started studying with him in my second year of undergraduate studies, Introduction to Manichaeism, and I knew I was hooked. And for then there has been more than half a century of intellectual exchange, deep personal links I had with him, with Miriam, both for myself and for my wife. Their home on Blumenfeld 8, we used to call Café Blumenfeld, and we spent many very pleasant afternoons and evenings there. Beyond the study of religion, we talked literature a lot, and even, if you can believe it, politics. His PhD study, his PhD thesis, which he wrote with Bruno Henning, a man who had escaped Nazi Germany, partly also because he was married to a Jew, sister of the late Professor Polotsky, and he knew that, as Henning said, anybody who has something between his ears knows that the devil exists. I mean, this generation had seen the devil. His PhD was called Wisdom of the Sasanian Sages, and for me, Shaul Shaked remains the last of the Sasanian sages. We approach the end of a long day, fascinating lectures. We must all be rather tired, so am I, as you can see. I have brutally shortened my paper because I felt unwell, but I promised the full version, of course, with in the book that should come out of this day. I also want to mention that in next June, in June 2023, there will be a 3 days conference, Yulia Rubanovic tells me this morning, on Irano-Judaica, a project started by Shaked in the early 1980s, and which will be dedicated to his memory. It seems that Shaked was not a great fan of this Israeli troubadours, a troupe called the Pale Scout, Hagashash Achiver. But I want to end with actually quoting my wife, quoting them, saying, there's a guy here, too bad he isn't here. יש פה מישהו, יש פה אחד, חבל שהוא איננו. Sometime in 1987, Shaul Shaked asked me to chair a session at one of the Irano-Judaica conferences that he had been organizing in Jerusalem. The first speaker, Khojeste Mistri, the president of the Parsi community in Bombay, referred with pride to the dualist character of the Zoroastrian religion. After him spoke Dastur Firoze Kotwal, the community's high priest, who rebuffed indignantly the president's claim. The high priest knew better. His prayers were addressed to the single God, and his religion squarely belonged to the monotheistic family. Odd as this may sound, and we've heard already time and again today how this can work, this remarkable altercation between the two dignitaries was only echoing a major scholarly argument on the original nature of Zarathustra's religion. Was it essentially a form of monotheism with Ahura Mazda as its single god on top of the two opposing spirits, Penta Mainyu and Angra Mainyu, which only later turned into a dualistic system, or rather, from the start, a dualism in which the radical opposition between the two spirits stands at the core of the religious system? Shaked on Iranian dualism. Throughout 2 generations of scholarly publications, Shaul Shaked returned time and again to the topic of Iranian dualism, in particular during the Sasanian period, of which he stressed the formative character for Judaism and Christianity up to the birth of Islam. In particular, he devoted to the topic a whole monograph representing the text of his Jordan lectures in comparative religion at SOAS, Dualism in Transformations, Varieties of Religion in Sasanian Iran. And in a sense, the title of my presentation is an homage to this book. As he has argued, polemics with monotheists did much to sharpen the self-definition of Mazdians as dualists. Indeed, according to him, one cannot find in the extant sources before the Sasanian period a single declared dualist stand. Shaked has consistently insisted that the dualist character of Mazdaism, just like that of Manichaeism, is essentially ethical rather than ontological. Indeed, the two realms, the spiritual, Menog, and the material, Getig, may in no way be perceived as hierarchically ordered, as they are for the Platonist tradition, for instance. While Ormazd, the good principle, created the material world, the realm of Ahriman, the evil principle, the realm of Ahriman, the evil principle, has no Getig and therefore cannot really be said to fully exist. In such an ethical type of dualist religion, the good principle possesses an inbuilt advantage, and it must eventually win its battle against the evil principle. The balance is heavily tipped, had noted Shaked in an early article of his. 25 years later, he was more categorical. A religion, I quote, a religion based on ethical dualism cannot really uphold a symmetry of two powers. A related and significant point made by Shaked on the structure of Mazdian dualism is what I propose to call its Trinitarian nature. The lack of symmetry between the two realms is highlighted by the existence of a third principle. In the Western texts, Ahura Mazda stands above Spenta Mainyu, the bounteous spirit, who is set against Angra Mainyu, the evil spirit. Shaked points out that it is only during the Sasanian period that this divine triangle would be transformed into a more rigid dualism. It is only in the Parlevi books, he writes, that the two powers or principles are not subordinate of each other or to a third power. There, Shaked sought to shed light on a crux in Plutarch's Isis and Osiris, where Mithra is described as being a mediator, Mesites, between Ormazd and Ahriman. In this article, Shaked discusses the semantics of mianchik, arbiter, go-between, umpire, judge, its equivalent in Middle Persian. Concluding, he is able to identify three different types of the third principle in late Iranian religion. Either the third principle is the middle region, neutral or inactive between the two realms, or it refers to the Otios, supreme god, origin of the two antagonists, as Zurvan is. Finally, it can be like Miher, that is to say Mithra, a judge, or mediator, the embodiment of justice. Shaked's understanding of Mazdaism, moreover, highlights the fact that two dimensions coexist in its dualism, which is at once horizontal, Ormazd versus Ahriman, and vertical, Ahura Mazda above the two opposing powers. I am obviously in no position to assess Shaked's arguments. What I wish to do here, rather, is to show how his insights on the nature of Mazdian dualism are confirmed and their epistemic value broadened when one looks at other dualist patterns of religious thought in the late ancient Near East. More specifically, I shall discuss a few instances of dualism in Gnostic, Marcionite, and Manichaean traditions, seeking to show, at least briefly, how these various forms of dualism interplay and how they echo those identified by Shaked in the Iranian tradition. And I've dropped here for this presentation my subchapter on dualism in Judaism. First, the Gnostic Mesotes. Various heresies of early Christianity are commonly referred to as Gnosticism in modern scholarship. This traditional term, however, has been questioned in the last generation by scholars for whom the differences between the various sects and doctrines seem stronger than the similarities between them. I must say that I remain unconvinced by the epistemic value of this argument. In order to give up on Gnosticism, one must find another, more useful term in order to explain the isomorphism between the various doctrines as related by the patristic heresiographies and as reflected in the primary texts themselves, mainly those found in Coptic translation at Nag Hammadi in the late 1940s. Incidentally, the simultaneousness of the discoveries at Qumran and at Nag Hammadi should trigger a comparative study of these two major textual discoveries and how they transformed our understanding of the cradle and crucible of early Christianity. This denomination, Gnosticism, comes from gnosis, knowledge in Greek, and denotes an esoteric knowledge endowed with a salvific character, permitting the Gnostic to escape the material world created by a lower god. The contradistinction between the lower demiurge and the higher god colors at once, with a marked dualist character, a movement which has been the object of intensive research since the 19th century. A number of Protestant theologians, applying a critical acumen to the scriptures and the orthodox understanding of religious history in particular, had an instinctive sympathy, or at least a powerful attraction, for movements rejected as heretical by the Church Fathers, and what they dubbed early Catholicism, the Protestants. In the last decades of the century, of the 19th century, Wilhelm Busset and his colleagues from the Religionsgeschichtliche Schule in Göttingen sought to highlight the so-called Oriental character and the Iranian origins of Gnosticism, a movement characterized by sharp dualism and radical pessimism. Bousset states that Gnosticism's basic feature is a sharp dualism and a radical pessimism towards this lower natural world. End of quotation. The leading Berlin theologian Adolf Harnack, later Adolf von Harnack, famously insisted, on the contrary, that Gnosticism represented the radical Hellenization, the akute Hellenisierung of Christianity. The two antithetic positions of Bousset and Harnack, however, played down the fact that as a syncretistic phenomenon, Gnosticism had multiple roots, and that side by side with Iran and Greece, Israel should have been seriously taken into account, as the early Gnostic myths seek to offer an inverted version of biblical cosmogony, anthropogony, and the early history of humankind. At the time, of course, Gnosticism was mainly known through the patristic heresiologists, from Irenaeus of Lyon in the 2nd century to Epiphanius of Salamis in the 4th, writers whose intention was more to fight the hydra of heresy than to describe accurately its main tenets. It is only with the discovery and the publication of the Gnostic Coptic library found at Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt after the Second World War that our knowledge of Gnosticism, which now could be established on primary sources, would change in dramatic manner. While the traditional scholarly consensus used to refer to Gnosticism as a dualistic religion, recent research has cast doubt upon such a representation. Simone Petremont, the author of a monumental and synthetic study of Gnosticism, already pointed out that most Gnostics were monists, although she spoke of a dualist sentiment as defining the Gnostic attitude. This dualist sentiment emphasizes the abyss between the true and supreme God, who is wholly good, and the lower demiurge, who enslaved Adam and made a covenant with Noah, in the Apocalypse of Adam, for instance. This demiurge, or chief archon, either called Sabaoth, Yaldabaoth, or Samael, is identified with the God of the Jews, the lawgiver and the father of Satan in the system of the Archontics, according to Epiphanius. A strong anti-Jewish proclivity is felt in many of the Gnostic texts and traditions. For Basilides, for instance, in early 2nd century Alexandria, a man who has been dubbed by Bentley Layton the first Christian philosopher, Jesus was sent for the destruction of the God of the Jews. In the mythology of the Apocryphon of God, the demiurge also created the counterfeit spirit, Antimimon Pneuma, a Satan of sorts, as is the adversary, Antikymenon, in the Epistle to Flora, Gnostic texts, seeking to closely imitate the good God. Although he remains invisible, beyond human grasp, the Supreme God or Father, as he is also called in some Valentinian texts, such as the Gospel of Truth or the Gospel of Philip, may be approached through his Son, who emanated from him and bears his name. A dualist sentiment, however, does not necessarily point to a dualistic doctrine. In the late 2nd century, indeed, Irenaeus is a witness to the fact that almost all heretics claim the existence of a single God, although they transform it through their perverse doctrine. Following Elaine Pagels, for whom Valentinus thought was exhibiting a modified monotheism, that's her epithet, modified, various scholars argue that dualism cannot really be conceived as a defining quality of Gnostic thought. This approach is consistent with the testimony of Irenaeus, for whom heretics, that is to say those who we now call Gnostics, claim a single God, whom, however, they transform profoundly in their myth. Karen King, in particular, highlights the fluidity and imprecision with which the term of dualism is used. As such disclaimers correctly notice, the evidence of most Gnostic texts does not warrant seeing them as embodying a full-fledged dualist belief in two thoroughly conflicting gods. What they ignore, however, is that a similar theological structure, which does not amount to a radical dualism, seems to be also the case elsewhere. A more satisfying approach, I think, would call attention to the presentation of the supreme God in a number of Gnostic texts and traditions as the stranger God. In Gnostic parlance, stranger refers to the transcendent character of the supreme God, who remains not only unknown, but also unknowable. Henri Charles Puech has offered, almost 2 generations ago, a remarkable phenomenological analysis of this character of the supreme God, who remains in all Gnostic texts at once different from and higher than the lower demiurge, the Jewish God. In order to assess the nature of Gnostic dualism, I will refer here to one classical text from the first half of the 2nd century, the Epistle of Flora, to Flora, already mentioned, attributed to Ptolemy, a disciple of Valentinus. This text, which is presented as the exposition of the doctrine to a fellow traveler, succinctly and clearly presents the structure of its modified dualism. For since the division of the law, that is to say God's own law, was established neither by the perfect God, I'm quoting, sorry, for since the division of the law was established neither by the perfect God, as we have taught, nor surely by the devil, which it would be wrong to say, then the establisher of this division of the law is distinct from them. And he is the demiurge and maker of the universe and of the things within it, since he is different from the essences of the other two and is in a state intermediate between them, he would rightfully be described by the term intermediateness, mesotes. And if the perfect God is good according to his nature, and indeed, as indeed he is, for our Savior showed that one only is there who is good, namely his Father, whom he manifested. And furthermore, and if furthermore, the law belonging to the nature of the adversary is both evil and wicked, and is stamped in the mold of injustice, in the next paragraph, the adversary, antikimenon, is said to be material, hulikos, in his essence, then a being that is in a state intermediate between these and is neither good nor evil or unjust, might well probably be called just, dikaios, of the justice that is his. The structure of the divine world is clearly expressed in this text, while it does not reflect adequately that structure in all Gnostic traditions. It is clearly representative of a major trend of Christian Gnosticism. Ptolemy, a leading disciple of Valentinus, wrote around the mid-2nd century, but Valentinian communities remained active in the East throughout late antiquity, the long late antiquity. The material nature of the devil in this text is strikingly different from the essence of Ahriman in the Sasanian period, an entity with no getig or material existence. The triadic structure clearly enunciated in the Epistle to Flora, however, seems to be similar to that of the Mazdian traditions, with the principle of justice as intermediary between the good and the evil principles. It may be presented as a modification of either dualism or monotheism. I really don't feel well. I have two more sub-chapters, one on Marcion called The Stranger God, and one on Manichaeism called The King and the Swine, and I will skip, I will go to my conclusion.
Are you sure? Yeah, perhaps you should.
Just a few sentences. It's called The Paradox of Dualism. This brief review of some dualist religious movements of late antiquity is, of course, far from an exhaustive study, which should not overlook the Nachleben of some of these trends. At the end of our period, the birth and dramatic growth of Islam, certainly the most rigorous form of Abrahamic monotheism, would also see a number of heretical movements. In her last magisterial book, Patricia Crone has offered us more than a glimpse of these new landscapes in Iranian lands, which often reflect dualist thought patterns echoing those from the period which has occupied us here. Let us return to the story of the community president and the high priest, with which we began. Dualism is an ethic term.
Excuse me, if you are not speaking well, you should stop.
I think what I want to I will end, I will say that basically both dualism and Manichaeism, both dualism and monotheism show a Trinitarian structure. If I could have demonstrated. Thank you.